Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 126. This week the questions are taken from Guide 190 on HMS Resolution and the video on Western Approaches Command, the second one we've done, the return of the map. Josh Thomas Moore asks, in 1942 the SS Normandy burned in port. How common and easy was this to happen? Distressingly common actually. Obviously, somewhat more prevalent in the age of sail, when everything was made of wood, canvas, rope, pitch, and all other kinds of wonderful burnable materials. The number of Royal Navy warships, for example, that are to a certain degree relatively well known from having been either very prestigious ships like Henry Grace à Dieu, or Sovereign of the Seas, or Queen Charlotte. Those have either been very prestigious or been in, they've led fleets in battle. The number of those kinds of ships that have either been heavily damaged or destroyed later on, having survived enemy fleets, storms, etc., and just been destroyed by accidental fire or as they're heavily damaged, is quite worrying. Statistically, if you are on a ship that is basically a gigantic candle, eventually some kind of fire is going to break out, and it's just down to how quick and effective your crew are at containing it. I mean, even as museum ships, they're not necessarily safe. I was lucky enough to see the Cutty Sark in London several times when I was younger, but then more recently it caught fire, if I recall correctly, because someone left a Hoover on, a vacuum cleaner, for those of you who aren't in the UK. And you might think, well, surely the age of iron ships and then steel ships should have reduced that. And yes, to a certain degree, that is true. The hull itself is somewhat harder to set fire to these days. However, that hasn't stopped ships being lost to fire. I mean, one of the things is that obviously iron and steel ships carried considerably larger magazines than their age of sail counterparts, largely because of their increased size, and the explosives themselves also tend to be somewhat more volatile once they actually started burning, which meant that when ships, especially warships, obviously caught fire, they tended to go up rather spectacularly if you weren't very quick off the mark. And in civilian ships, like the Normandy, there were a lot of fixtures and fittings inside the ship, wall panels, carpets, that kind of stuff, that were still very flammable. And with the increasing rise of mechanization, you've got things like initially coal, then oil, grease, dust, all those kind of things, and yeah, they're pretty flammable as well. So there are plenty of things that can still burn aboard a ship, and ships these days don't have quite the same massive aversion to any kind of open flame or heat source that you might have had on an age of sail ship, which not entirely, but so to a certain extent counterbalances the fact that ships are slightly harder to set on fire. And of course, more recently you've got the example of the Bonhomme Richard, which, yeah, that shows even a warship can accidentally burn up if the circumstances are right, or I suppose very wrong, depending on whose side of the equation you're looking at there. So yeah, it's still surprisingly common to see ships catch fire and become heavily damaged or burn out, but somewhat less so than the age of sail these days. Kumori asks, why were the superstructures on the Fuso class so tall and narrow proportionally compared to other Japanese Navy ships such as the Nagato or Ise classes? They had tall towers as well, but Fuso's is much narrower. Did the Japanese just get better at optimizing the pagoda tower design, or was it a case of more precise machinery being needed for Fuso and Yamashiro? It's a case of incremental improvement, basically. The Fusos were the first of the big Japanese battleships to go in for serious refits that would turn out the pagoda style of mast, followed by the Isseis, then the Nagatos and the Kongos. And as a result, the Fusos, whilst they had this concept of more rangefinders, more gun positions, more spotting positions, etc., etc., this was kind of the first pass at trying to implement that. And then lessons learned from that were taken into the refit of Issei and Hyuga and Nagato and Mutsu, etc., etc. And if you actually line up all the refitted and modernized Japanese battleships and battle cruisers in chronological order, you can actually see the way the pagoda mast style is gradually being refined. You can see which bits they're losing, which bits they're adding, which bits they're trimming, to the point that by the time you get to the Kongos and they're just fine-tuning and experimenting a bit, one of the Kongos actually carries a bridge structure style that is very similar to the one you see on Yamato. And the reason for that is because it was the prototype, or at least the test article, for the one that they were thinking of installing on the Yamato and Musashi, for obvious reasons. So yeah, it's just simple incremental design philosophy. You see this also quite a bit in a number of other modernizations. You look at some of the Italian battleship modernizations, the Cavour, the Cesare, etc. The ones that go in first come out looking slightly different to the ones that follow. Same with the Royal Navy. Warspite is one of the first that gets modified. It looks slightly different, a little bit more of a halfway house compared to Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. And whilst the incremental learning process is not quite as present in the US refits, even there you see a certain degree of difference between the various refits, even between refits of the same class of ship, depending on exactly when they hit the dockyard. So, ironically enough, some of the ships that survive Pearl Harbor the best, like the Maryland or the Tennessee, by the end of the war actually look slightly less advanced than something like, say, West Virginia, which by the time it's been up, out and sent over to the continental United States, the yards have already got a certain amount of experience refitting the less damaged other standard battleships, and they've also got a little bit more time on West Virginia because of the amount of damage they've got to fix, and that in turn means that some of the last standards to be modernized, even though they were the most heavily damaged and in some cases quite old, actually have significantly more advanced systems than the ones that came out of Pearl Harbor, that's somewhat better. And you see this at Surigao Strait, actually. If you look at the ships that have the most advanced radar systems and are able to dish out the most damage to the Japanese, generally are actually, at least for the battleships, they're generally actually the ones that took the longest to get back onto frontline service. Next, we have a question. Interesting that they removed, this is from HMS Resolution, that they removed her superchargers after they upgraded her elevation. Why? Surely supercharged shells at greater elevations would have better range. It comes down to the nature of the superchargers. For those of you who aren't aware, the 15-inch 42 guns that were on most British capital ships in the interwar and World War II period were equipped in some cases where the gun elevation was still limited to 20 degrees with what called superchargers, and this effectively meant taking the normal amount of charge that you use to fire a shell and then sitting there and calculating very carefully how much extra charge can we stick in, basically with the idea that obviously more gun power equals shell goes further, harder shell hits, more penetration shell has, but mainly the range issue. But obviously you can't keep doing this indefinitely because otherwise you end up blowing up the gun. And the 15-inch 42 gun was good, very good in fact, and so it could take a certain amount of overcharging without destroying itself. But even so, the additional power and the additional burn of the extra explosive would result in increased barrel wear. And this is the thing, if you have the elevation increased, usually up to 30 degrees, then the guns can fire further on the standard charges anyway. And so hitting your target at distance is now no longer an issue. At which point, yes, in theory, having your gun able to elevate up to 30 degrees and fire supercharges would make your gun incredibly powerful. And indeed, HMS Vanguard was designed to be able to do this, although since she never served in war, she wasn't actually issued with the superchargers because of the aforesaid barrel wear issues. But there was one other issue, which is that with that extra explosive in the gun, that meant that the gun would recoil more, and if the gun was elevated up to 20 degrees, this wasn't too much of a problem. There was enough spare travel in the existing turret for that to occur. But if you're going to elevate it up to 30 degrees, there needed to be modifications to the turret as well in order to accommodate the additional force of the recoil and the additional distance it might need to travel. And so with something like Vanguard, yes, it was worth doing that because, well, they weren't building the turrets from scratch, but they were refurbishing them from scratch. But in an R class or one of the QEs or whatever, it wasn't economically or practically worth increasing the range and hitting power of the 15-inch 42 by the extent that you would get from having both supercharges and increased elevation, if it meant you had to basically take the entire turret apart and rebuild it from the ground up to accommodate for those additional factors. And yes, the hitting power probably would have been very useful if they'd ended up in a fight with a modern battleship, but that range, it kind of comes back to my previously stated point at fair length about the fact that actually gun ranges in moving battleship engagements much beyond 28-30,000 yards are pretty useless in terms of actually hitting anything because of a number of factors, including just the sheer travel time of the shells. It's not to say you can't hit stuff beyond it, but if you are, then the captain of the other ship is doing a terribly bad job and probably doesn't actually matter about the range because they would have been hit anyway. Because they weren't evading and they weren't paying attention to what was going on around them. James Stember asks, you noted that one of Resolution's guns is on permanent static display at the Imperial War Museum. From what I can tell, this is an uncommon display, with ships and classes either entirely lost to time on the breakers or preserved near completely as museum ships. Do you know of any other such static displays of major components, not necessarily just the guns? There are actually quite a few bits and pieces of ship floating around the world. Well, not literally, obviously, but some of them were intentional, some of them were actually fairly unintentional. So the picture, for example, shows one of the 11-inch turrets from Gneisenau. That was not intended to be the last and only permanent memorial to the ship. They were taken off when the ship was taken into Drydock, and they were expecting to refit it with twin 15-inch guns. That didn't happen because it got hit by bombs and largely blown out. And as a result, this turret that had been taken off and refitted into a fort is all that remains of the ship. You've also got, for example, at the Den Helder Museum in the Netherlands, there is the bridge tower superstructure, whatever you want to call it, from one of the De Zeven Prevention class cruisers. That's actually really interesting, especially when you get up into the gigantic radar dome. There's various bits and pieces from the original HMAS Sydney, the World War I variant, in Australia. There's a few bits of the USS South Dakota, which are preserved in her name state. When the SS Great Eastern was broken up, her topmast actually ended up as a flagpole at Liverpool Football Club's stadium, of all places. And there's a few others floating around, not counting, of course, things like nameplates, battle honour plates, and figureheads that are stashed away in various museums, because there's an awful lot of those. Mitch Watson asks, what is the purpose of sub-capital fighting ships? As in, why did all the navies not just go with battleships to do the fighting, and destroyers for all other roles? So there are three strands to the answer. There's explaining the role of the intermediate fighting ship, i.e. the cruiser, is pretty much a massive video in and of itself. But anyway, quick version. Firstly, destroyers, or torpedo boat destroyers, as we properly understand them, don't actually exist till the end, pretty much the end of the 19th century, and they have a fair way to go until they're a viable fleet unit even after that. So pretty much until the late 1900s, destroyers just aren't a thing, really, for one. Secondly, the strategic part of showing the flag, trade, commerce, protection, etc. Battleships are all well and good, but you can build a fair number of merchant ships that are faster than battleships, and you can't afford enough battleships to show the flag if you have all these colonial overseas possessions and still maintain a strong defence at home. So you need something that's big and scary and impressive enough to do the show the flag missions, and also is fast enough to hunt down enemy merchant shipping and can be built in large enough numbers that, you know, you can actually have enough of them spread out over the world. The third aspect is the actual combat aspect, the tactical aspect, if you like. So destroyers, not particularly long ranged. Cruisers are long range. So destroyers are great for attacking and defending the battle fleet during the early part of their development, sort of late 1900s, World War One, most of the interwar period. Up in World War II, once refueling at sea gets going, this mitigates the problem somewhat, but not entirely. But basically, destroyers are very short range. So the minute your battle fleet goes away from your operational zone, where all your ports are, your destroyers can't come with you, which is a little bit of a problem if you're attacking an enemy fleet a long way away, and obviously they have destroyers with all their torpedoes on because they're close to their home ports, and you can stage a few out with you with refueling, but not anywhere near enough. Cruisers, on the other hand, have a significantly longer range, which means they can accompany you. The other thing is that battleships are heavily optimized to try and kill other battleships, so especially by the time of the Dreadnought era, but even in the pre-Dreadnought era, big heavy guns for the primary armaments. Even the secondary and in pre-Dreadnought tertiary armaments are still fairly heavy. It's only with pre-Dreadnoughts when you get down to sometimes the tertiary, usually the quaternary armaments or beyond, that small anti-torpedo boat or anti-destroyer guns are equipped. And yes, okay, in the Dreadnoughts, the secondary battery gradually evolves initially as an anti-destroyer battery. But if you're in gun range of a battleship, when you're talking about the secondary or quaternary battery, depending if you're Dreadnought or pre-Dreadnought, the destroyer's probably either already in torpedo range or close enough that at least some of them are going to get there. Whereas if you put all these rapid-firing guns on a cruiser, and the cruiser can be somewhere that your battleship isn't, and hopefully somewhere between where the enemy destroyers are and your battleship, then they can take out the destroyers at a nice safe distance from your big expensive battleships. And it turns out that actually a cruiser covered in masses of fast-firing but relatively heavy as far as destroyers are concerned guns does tend to rip destroyers apart quite nastily. So there's a definite utility for them there. Plus, as I said, long range allows them to do their own independent cruising missions, commerce raiding, convoy escort against other cruisers that are trying to commerce raid, etc., etc. It's essentially, if you magically eliminated cruisers completely, they would very rapidly grow up again, even if it was just purely on the basis that someone would build a larger and larger destroyer in an attempt to overwhelm enemy destroyers with gunpowder. And indeed you actually see this with the French and Italian destroyers especially, and to a certain extent attempts with the German destroyers in the run-up to World War II. Plus, in the era of the pre-Dreadnought, it was sometimes thought that at least the armoured cruisers could almost be like a second-rate battleship for countries that couldn't quite afford a fleet of full, proper, actual battleships, or overseas squadrons that might be looking to supplement a single battleship with some extra hitting power if they needed to go and bully someone who wasn't armed with a sharp piece of guava fruit. Ofo10 asks, On what scale are marine models preferable? That depends entirely on what you're trying to do with them. And, well, if, for example, you are trying to replicate the entire Battle of Jutland on a scale that isn't going to require a large sports hall and a lot of people and a truly stupid amount of money, then you want something very, 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 very small. As you would have seen in the Battle of Jutland video, something like 1 to 6,000 scale is good for that. If you want to replicate a small squadron action, something like that, then something in the order of 1 to 1200 or 1 to 800, or maybe if you're pushing it 1 to 600 scale is quite good, at least if we're still talking about battleships, cruisers and destroyers. So you'll see stuff like Warlord Games models for the Victory at Sea series manufacturing that scale, as are a number of other war game naval series that are used for those kind of small fleet, small squadron actions. If you want a ship to display, if you want lots of ships, then you're probably actually then pushing into 1 to 600, 1 to 800, 1 to 720 for some reason is very popular. Going down to maybe 1 to 500 scale. Those are quite good for display on shelves. Then you've got the ubiquitous 1 to 350 scale, which is good for really detailed, really nice models, but unless you've got an awful lot of display space, you can't have quite as many of them as you might have for some of the smaller scale ships. So, and obviously they do take a lot longer to build, so there's that. They are truly generally works of art, but they take a lot of time and a lot of space, as I said. And then you get into the slightly worrying areas where the scale numbers trend down to the low hundreds or even the mere double digits. That's when you have models that are basically museum type models, because they are huge and they take ridiculous amounts of time to do. They quite often have a number of working parts, and they also tend to be, shall we say, hilariously expensive. Now, there are other uses for those kinds of models, believe it or not. At that scale, some people build versions and fit them with BB guns and wooden balsa armour and sail around on lakes and shoot at each other with their various, well, not at each other, but shoot at each other's models in recreating little naval battles, which is quite funny. Sometimes they just sail around looking quite pretty, and sometimes that's also the kind of scale you'll see some film props and film shooting models at, and the film shooting models can get even bigger. But yeah, sometimes you'll end up with something like this. Yeah, they're pretty cool and they're pretty big, but you ain't reenacting Jutland using this scale unless well, unless you have more money than sense and or are trying to make a film from it. Commander Stefan asks, can you tell us about the Russian naval doctrines? Oh boy. If there's one navy that's seen almost as many ups and downs over the course of its lifetime as the US Navy has, with Congress's yo-yo-like budget control, it's the Russian Navy. To be fair, for a long period of time, at least as far as the Age of Sail goes, the Russian naval policy was that we don't have a naval policy because we don't really have a navy, because we're a socking great land power, and, well, most of our ports ice up for half or more of the year, and the warm water ports that we would desperately like keep getting taken away from us, and we keep having to fight for them. And ultimately, we've got so much land, it doesn't really matter if you blockade our ports, because we'll just keep going on land, and we have massive armies, so we can just invade people directly because we have land borders with everyone, or, well, everyone that we want to immediately fight anyway. So that was the initial Russian naval doctrine, kind of around about the time when the Spanish Armada is taking place, and Western Europe is freaking out about who should have the biggest galleon. The Russians are sitting there going, yes, what is galleon? You say galleon, I say 100,000 soldiers. But no, in more seriousness, Peter the Great is in many ways considered the founder of the modern Russian Navy, and for good reason. Very underappreciated conflict up there in the Baltic, where the Russians and the Swedes, again, relatively underappreciated naval power, decided to go full-on hammer and tongs with literally every piece of naval technology known to mankind at the time. Everything from full-on line battle units down to galleys, as in, yes, rowed and sail-driven galleys with rams, etc., up in the Baltic, if you can believe that. Turned out that they're actually really good in the shallows. And actual full-on amphibious warfare as well. So, and the Russian Navy basically went from a bit of a standing joke to, wow, is actually a pretty well-developed and capable force, as was the Swedish Navy, within the space of a very few years. Then, of course, suffered from significant amount of neglect, and then was brought back, and then was neglected again, and then was brought back and neglected again, and so on and so forth. And that's pretty much been the state of the Russian Navy ever since. Periods of significant investment followed by periods of significant neglect and having to almost restart the whole thing from scratch. I mean, you can see this kind of thing when you look at the Russian sort of prime age of sail fleets. You don't hear too much about them during the Napoleonic Wars, although they were there. Then they kind of drift off. Everyone's kind of very quiet about things. Then they show up for things like the Battle of Sinop against the Turks and start blowing them up with shell guns. Then you have the Crimean War. The British and the French show up, and the Russians kind of just go, yeah, no, we're not fighting you lot. That's a dumb idea to try and fight you at sea. And sink most of their ships in a harbour to stop the British and the French getting them, which I suppose is fair because, let's face it, if they'd left any decent-sized ships floating, you can guarantee the British would have tried to steal at least one. And then after that, they kind of built their way back up again. Lots of protected cruisers, armoured cruisers, some really big ones that caused a few scares like the Rurik. And they were just getting their stride back when the the Russo-Japanese War kind of put a bit of a break on all of that, and they're trying to sort it themselves out again as the Russian Imperial Navy. Then came the Russian Revolution and World War One, not necessarily in that order, and everything fell into neglect because it turns out that yeah, you can't reallocate the means of propulsion, nor can you try and run a combat ship as a democracy. So the initial attempts at Soviet naval power, let's just say, didn't go particularly well. Then the Soviets kind of realised, okay, that's a stupid idea. And then you had the classic fleet of the Cold War. And that's about where I'm going to stop on that particular topic. So Russian naval doctrine has kind of evolved and in some cases devolved with the rise and fall of the Russian fleet. Not helped by the fact that for the majority of the period the Russians have actually had to worry about having a fleet. They've actually got to deal with multiple fleets, which are usually so far and disconnected from each other that there's no way they can mutually support each other except in the longest and most drawn out of conflicts, because they've got to deal with the Pacific. And yeah, we know how well that's gone for them in the past century or so. You've then got the Black Sea, which is, of course, connected to the Mediterranean, but by a very narrow strait that's usually held by someone the Russians are not very happy with, which is, for most of the period, the Ottoman Empire. Then you've got the Baltic, which is, generally speaking, the area the Russians are really the most interested in, but is also surrounded by the most people who keep trying to fight them over the course of various parts of history, as that's access to the main shipping routes with much of the rest of the Western world. And then, of course, you've got the northern coast, so up around past Scandinavia. And whilst that has held a certain amount of importance for most of Russia's existence, it's only really taken off as a major naval interest more in the era of steam and steel, etc., etc., because that is not the world's most friendly environment to operate in, shall we say. So each of those fleets has had to have its own objectives. They've got to have their own ship designs. They've got to have their own strategies. So, I mean, this is probably a fairly lengthy answer, but hopefully it gives you some idea of just how complex Russian naval history actually is. As far as what those individual Russian naval doctrines are, that's going to be the subject for a very long Wednesday video at some point. But yeah, hopefully you can begin to appreciate just how much of a complex task anyone called Admiral of the Russian or Imperial Russian Navy will face at any given point in history. Paul Pomikala asks, since ship armour was not structural in nature, how was it attached to the ship? There were a number of methods, but generally for most of the period you're looking at either riveting or welded bolts, one of the two. The other interesting thing is exactly what's behind the armour, which does to a certain extent how you're fixing it on. So in this particular picture, which you can see is actually HMS Tiger, the bow of HMS Tiger being fitted out during its construction period, you might notice it looks like it's a bit of a hybrid warship. There's an awful lot of wood involved there. And yeah, no, Tiger was not in fact armoured with wood, but it kind of was. This is the teak backing that sat behind the armour plating to help absorb some of the shock of impact and mainly to catch splinters spalled off the back of the armour plate. This is not something you see very much in photos of ships, but this particular photo was very lucky enough to be given permission to use, so here it is for everyone's education and delight. And you'll also notice, if you see close-up photos of ships being launched, that they are usually launched without their armour plate in place, and you can also usually then see the mounting points for, usually, as I say, the rivets, where they're going to be attaching the plate to. So yeah, that's a little bit of an insight as to how you get armour plates attached to a ship. It also makes it relatively easy to get rid of the armour plate if it's damaged, although to be perfectly honest, if something's around that's big enough to bend or break 9, 10, 12, 14 inches of armour steel, probably most of the things holding it on have broken as well, or at least been started, which does help in the removal of the damaged item. And next we have, of the surviving World War II battleships today, is USS Massachusetts the only one to have engaged another battleship? And if so, what other surviving museum ships from World War II have engaged or sunk battleships in surface-to-surface actions? Now, if you'd said which museum ships have engaged battleships or sunk them, generally there'd be a very, very interesting set of answers. For example, did you know the Italian Maz boat that sank the SMS Svent Istvan is still around in a museum, as is one or two of the coastal motor boats that were used to torpedo and attack various Russian ships in Kronstadt harbour immediately after World War I in the Baltic campaign of 1919-1920, including a couple of Russian battleships, albeit without too much effect. But regardless, you did say World War II, so in World War II specifically, as far as I'm aware, it comes down to 5 museum ships, one of which is HMS Belfast, which took on Scharnhorst alongside Sheffield and Norfolk, and the other 4 are all Essex-class carriers, Yorktown, Lexington, Hornet and Intrepid, all at various points launched their strike aircraft against enemy battleships. A couple of them actually against Musashi, and one, I think maybe 2, but definitely one against Yamato as well. So yeah, there's although they're not directly fighting, obviously ship to ship, their aircraft were. So yeah, apart from Massachusetts, if you want World War II specific, actually ended up shooting physically at battleships with guns installed, it's only Belfast. and then the 4 carriers if you count the weapon systems as well. That old milk carton asks, apparently one of the designs for Hull 797, one of the unbuilt Yamato class, had the central anti-aircraft gun nest replaced with 12 100mm twin gun turrets per side for 24 barrels per side. How effective would this have been as an AA defence, and even if all these guns could fit on the ship, wouldn't they just get in each other's way? As for how effective it would have been, the Japanese didn't really get quite as advanced as almost anybody else when it came to anti-aircraft fire control systems, so that would have limited the overall effectiveness of any Japanese battleship's anti-aircraft battery. But, with that said, as far as Japanese naval anti-aircraft guns went, the 100mm is pretty much the best one they've got, and indeed is actually a fairly superlative system in and of itself. It's a 100mm or 3.9-inch gun. They're actually legitimately very, very good weapons. It's just unfortunate they don't have a fire control system to match and weren't deployed in anywhere close to enough numbers for the Japanese Navy. But that probably represents the best anti-aircraft defense system you're going to get on the Japanese ships at the time. Certainly better than the 5-inch ostensibly dual-purpose weapons, and miles better than the varying iterations of the 25mm aircraft notification system that were festooned large numbers of Japanese ships towards the end of the war. As far as whether or not they could have gotten 12 mounts for it per side, 12 twin mounts, I actually think they probably could. The Yamato class was, well, for obvious reasons, a very big class, and they're also fairly wide because they don't have to quite get up to the same kind of speeds that the Iowas do, nor are they indeed as limited with Panama Canal constraints. And if you look at the historical anti-aircraft suite of Yamato in its final days, it does have an awful lot of guns on there. Being a 100mm as opposed to a 128mm gun, the Japanese twin mount is somewhat lighter, somewhere between half and 2/3 the weight of a 5-inch 38 twin mount, depending on exactly which 5-inch 38 twin mount you're looking at. So weight-wise, yeah, if you're looking at the sort of the 5-inch 38 mounts that trend to about twice the weight, yes, certainly weight-wise on something the size of Yamato, that's not going to be a problem. The only real constraint is real estate, but as I said, if you look at the Yamato's final stage anti-aircraft suite, you've got this stepped arrangement going on where you've got anti-aircraft guns and then other anti-aircraft guns stepped up slightly higher, and then other anti-aircraft guns step even higher behind them. So with the overall relative size of the 100mm mounts, I don't think that's going to be too much of a problem. I mean, if you've got 12 to get on, you can easily get 6 between the aft gun turret and the super firing of the 4 gun turrets. You can certainly get 6 in a line, at which point you could, I'd say probably knowing the Japanese, maybe get another 4 stood up one level above them and behind them, and then maybe another 2 on significantly higher mounts behind them. Or with a little bit of arcing of the formation, you could probably get 8 and 4 or 7 and 5 or something like that, with the higher number being kind of an arc of deck level mounts with then a smaller arc of higher level mounts behind them. I'm fairly confident you could actually get them to fit. Yeah, there might be a little bit of overlap of fire, but to be perfectly honest, the vast majority of battleship secondaries, once they get mounted in turrets, have a certain degree of overlap of fire. That's why they have safety stops and cutouts. I don't think they'd get in each other's way, and it certainly would be a much better way for such a ship to defend itself than let's add infinite numbers of 25mm and hope for the best, which seemed to be the approach on an awful lot of other Japanese Navy ships of the period. Specialist 290 asks, how far back does the idea of preserving certain unique or noteworthy ships as memorials and or museums go? It seems as though organised ship preservation efforts really started to take off around the turn of the 20th century, but were there any notable efforts made to preserve specific ships before then? There appears to have been a kind of on-again, off-again museum ship fad that goes throughout history. I mean, if you go back all the way back to ancient Greece, and assuming you believe ancient Greek legends have a kernel of fact in them, the literal ship of Theseus was probably the world's first recorded museum ship, at least until it collapsed and killed Theseus, which was a little bit of an inconvenience for both of them, I suspect. But generally, throughout most of history, whether or not a ship was kept around for a significant period of time well after its use as an actual combat vessel had passed seems to have largely been predicated on whether it was either a very noteworthy capture from the enemy or if it had achieved something particularly spectacular during its own lifetime. A number of ships also seem to have indications they probably would have been kept around for a lot longer, but then unfortunate incidents befell them. So, for example, both actually around about the time of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, you have the Royal James, which the Dutch captured, and then they, even though they couldn't use it, they kept the stern panelling from it, and they've still got that to this day. I mean, that's not the whole museum ship, but I get the feeling if they could have made better use of it, they probably would have kept it around for a good long while. And similarly, Sovereign of the Seas, that ship was well into its 50s by the time it was accidentally burnt. And, I mean, yes, it was still fairly big and still fairly powerful, but it was also getting on quite a bit. It was a little bit decrepit. It would have required a massive amount of work to get it back up into sort of full combat capability, but given its size, its majesty, and the legend that it had built up around it, I suspect it probably would have even kept around for quite a while thereafter. I don't necessarily think it would have lasted all the way to today, but there's an outside chance it might have. The Golden Hind is actually a good example of a ship that, well, yes, it was technically a warship, or privateering ship at least, but its main claim to fame was its circumnavigation of the world. That was kept around as a museum ship for well over half a century, but eventually also had to be broken up because it had rotted away, which was a bit annoying. But so a lot of these, what you might like to call early museum ships, they were kept around. People definitely wanted to see them around, but they also didn't have the time, resources, massive desire to run through the significant expense of maintaining them, in especially obviously with wooden ships, in the manner that they would need. And you've got to bear in mind that at those times, that's, even though today maintaining a wooden museum ship is quite an effort, A, we have a lot more advanced preservation technology, and B, it is, due to the massively increased size and scope and technological level of general shipping, it is proportionally less expensive, although it is still fantastically expensive to do. But it's not quite as expensive, let's say, if they're refitting and preserving HMS Victory. Her analogous vessel these days would be one of the Queen Elizabeth class carriers, and it doesn't cost anywhere near as much to maintain Victory as it does to maintain one of those ships. So, but back in the day, when you've got, say, Golden Hind, 50 years down the line, she's still a somewhat small but relatively capable vessel if she was put back into service, so the cost of maintaining her is going to be comparable to her cost of maintenance in general life. And given her relative size and capabilities at the time, it's effectively a large frigate small destroyer in today's naval terms. In World War II naval terms, you're probably looking at something along the lines of a large light cruiser, maybe a small heavy cruiser, and actually keeping that going at that level of expense is quite a considerable investment compared to what it might be today. But as you know, the real kind of museum ship craze really kind of gets going in the late 19th early 20th centuries, and that's why you have some of the oldest continuously surviving museum ships around, Victory and Constitution, both very notable for their martial accomplishments, both kept around during the 19th century because of those. But as with many wooden museum ships like the ones we've just described, getting on into their 50s, 60s, 70s, at least from the time of decommission. Victory was well over a century old by the end of the 19th century. But they were decaying quite badly, and they lasted just long enough for interest in them to be revived and maintenance to be done. And then as the museum ship craze kind of caught on after that, then obviously they were preserved, and we have them to this day. And yeah, at that point everything kind of slotted into place where the finances, resources and maintenance capabilities existed. More and more ships were gradually preserved, or in the case of quite a few like Warrior or Great Britain or Vasa, reclaimed and then preserved. Moraxis asks, where did the concept of a class of ships come from, and what was the first class of ships? Oddly enough, depending on how loosely you want to define a class, kind of like museum ships, the idea of a overall class comes and goes, although in this case it's a lot more linked with economies of scale and the economic capability and central authority that's exerted by a country or nation generally, and its admiralty in specific. Now, the reason for that is that, well, what defines a class? They're generally held to be ships that are functionally, barring a few minor details, identical. But what a culture decides is the identical aspects of ship design does vary somewhat. So in a lot of cases, in the very earliest part of the age of guns, when you're still looking at wooden warships, most ships were defined either by how much they displaced, or more accurately, how much they could carry, tons burthen rather than tons of displacement, and also when it came to warships, by the number of guns. But you could say, right, I want to reinforce my navy, I want 5 ships built, each to carry 30 guns and to be of 700 tons burthen, which would be some quite large ships for that kind of period. But when the various builders put those ships together, they might roundabout have a rating of 700 tons burthen, and they might carry 30 guns, and if you were smart enough you might have actually even specified what kind of guns they should be carrying. But that's probably about the last bit of familial resemblance you'd see, because one ship might be shorter, another ship might be wider, one ship might be taller, another ship might be shorter. You might even have ships with completely different mast and rigging layouts, because it's just working to those particular specifications. Now, we might today call those a loosely related group of ships, but we wouldn't probably call it a class. Although if you ask the people at the time, are these kind of the same ships, they'd kind of probably think, yeah, they're supposed to be, at least. Sailing qualities might be completely out of whack with each other, but we gave them the most important specs, because, at least as far as warships were concerned, the two most important specs were how much firepower did they have and how much was it going to cost, because the bigger and heavier the ship, the more they'd be billed for. But when you go further back to, say, the Tudor period, and slightly before that, so 14th, 15th, 16th century, then at that point you're not seeing massive numbers of ships being produced at any one time, so the idea of a class doesn't really hold. So, for example, when you look at Henry VIII and the production of the Henry Grâce à Dieu, there is no concept that this is the lead ship of a class of galleons, because it's literally the king has just said, I want a big ship, bigger than yeah, all the other kings nearby, because I want to be able to show off. And similarly with the Mary Rose. The Mary Rose was, right, I want a ship of this capability, and I want it built now to strengthen my fleet, and that's it. You could argue maybe some of the smaller ships like galleys that were ordered in batches could be considered classes, but again, they kind of run afoul of this, how closely related actually are they? I suspect if you go back to the Roman period, you'll probably find that a lot of triremes and other ships, biremes and quinqueremes and quadremes and whatever, these ships probably would be closer to what we would recognise as classes, but that's because of more of the economic power and the centralisation of the Roman Empire. They had the ability to build large numbers of ships, and they were probably ordering significant numbers of ships from the same, if you like, shipyards, at which point they probably would come down and say, right, we want a trireme. To be honest, off the top of my head, I don't actually know the Roman units of measurement, most of them, but let's say they're like, I want a trireme that is 3/4 of a stadia long. I have no idea if that actually equates to something sensible, but I'm sure someone will tell me. So, I want a trireme 3/4 of a stadia long. It will have 40 rowers. It will have one mast, a ram. It will cost so many denarii, and I want you to build 20 of them. That would probably be what we would understand as a class these days, even if the Romans didn't necessarily think it to be so. But if you fast forward in time to 17th century, late 1600s, that's probably the start of what we would today recognise as the class system for warships coming in as a continuous thing that then runs forward to today. And that's when the various navies of Western Europe were able to start constructing large numbers of warships and specifying the dimensions, the armament, the displacement, etc. And then obviously constructing them. They weren't necessarily given names at that point. They were just sort of programs of, we are building X many ships to these specific dimensions. But it kind of all evolved on from there. So initially it was just, as I say, programs of, we're building this many ships to this specification, one specification, or maybe 2 or 3 different specifications if it's a particularly large building. And then once you get into the 1700s, you have what are called establishments, which is attempts to more broadly regulate it, where they say, right, well, a second-rate ship is this size, sort of exact dimensions, roughly this is the whole form of it, this is the armament split into the different gun decks and weights of guns, and then the various establishments were taken forward and taken forward and taken forward, and then by the middle of the 18th century people began to realise that maybe trying to regulate the entirety of our fleet to these very, very specific characteristics isn't necessarily going to work. So although establishments did continue on a little bit, once you get past the mid-1700s you begin to see full-on distinct classes of ships, at least as far as we record them. Graham R. asks, how did the invention of nitrocellulose in the world of small arms affect the development of naval artillery? The use of gun cotton, as it's more commonly known, or nitrocellulose, in naval artillery is actually something of a long and fraught story. The development of nitrocellulose as an explosive in and of itself was fairly fraught, considering the first major efforts to mass manufacture it resulted in, rather predictably, the detonation of the factory, which somewhat put efforts back for a few years. Nonetheless, by the latter half of the 19th century, people were very interested in the use of gun cotton as a potential replacement for gunpowder, not least because it burns with practically zero smoke. They did, however, run into a few issues. One of which was that one of the primary products of the combustion of nitrocellulose is water. And this has two problems. One of which is, well, you've now got a whole bunch of water inside your gun barrel, which means your gun is going to corrode very quickly. And secondly, nitrocellulose loses an awful lot of its explosive potential the minute it becomes damp. So if you fired a gun using gun cotton and then you reloaded it, and bear in mind we're still talking in large part about muzzle loading guns, you pushed your charge down, it's going to absorb a lot of the water from the previous firing, and then the velocity of your subsequent shot is going to be considerably less. So it would add a additional step, quite sort of a considerable scrubbing and drying out of the gun barrel to any loading procedure, which is something of an inconvenience, plus the degradation of the gun barrel itself. But that wasn't the main problem. The main problem was the fact that the nitrocellulose was much more powerful and much faster burning than gunpowder, so much so in fact that if you used a pure gun cotton charge on something the size of a naval artillery piece, there was a very high chance of you just blowing up the gun, because the round couldn't get out quick enough, the pressure would build up and the guns would fail. So initially gun cotton was not really seen as a replacement for powder. However, gun cotton did find a place fairly quickly in naval artillery in the warheads of shells, because, well, its sheer destructive potential when it's at the other end of the firing sequence, in or near your enemy's vessel, this is very much welcome. So gun cotton in various shapes, and forms was found in the explosive payload of naval artillery relatively quickly, as compared to its use as a propellant, which everyone very quickly agreed was probably not the world's best idea. However, as time went on, they were able to use gun cotton as part of a new generation of propellants, taking advantage of its less smoke generating capability and the fact that it had considerably more kick behind it, but then mitigating some of the more negative effects with other forms of explosive material. And then you got the last decade of the 19th century or so and into the 20th century, when you had things like cordite and other explosives that were used in different navies for their charges, which do consist of quite significant portions of gun cotton but mixed with other things. So yes, gun cotton did eventually, or nitrocellulose, make it into naval propellants, but it took a little while for it to be hybridized with other newly developed compounds in order to make it a useful component of the naval arsenal outside of, as I say, the warheads of shells. Clayton Bradish asks, in the Mark 14 torpedo video, you made the statement, "Yes, that Admiral King." Can you expand on how Admiral King qualified for such an identifier? Well, it's quite simple. Despite his various faults and despite his various strengths, and he had quite a few of both, Admiral King was a singularly uniquely devoted individual when it came to the US Navy. And as you probably gathered from my many comments on him, he had quite the vicious temper. So, when it comes to, in that particular video, the reason I said that Admiral King is, well, eventually the Mark 14 torpedoes designers' incompetence and unwillingness to change got back to Admiral King. And, well, as I mentioned, I think I've said in a few other places, if there's one thing Admiral King would absolutely fly off the handle about, it would be any threat to the US Navy. Now, double that up with the fact it's an internal threat to the lives of his men and the integrity of his ships. And, yeah, there are a few admirals in history that I would not want to cross. Admiral King is very definitely either at or near the very top of that list. Because, yeah, woe betide you in that case. I mean, if I had a time travel machine, obviously there are many things that one would like to do, but one of the things I would dearly like to do with a time travel machine, if I could, would be to be back in the office when Admiral King called some of the people who'd been refusing to address the issues with the Mark 14 torpedo to account. I would like to have been there, and I would like to have been there with a deck chair, an awful lot of popcorn, and probably the world's biggest grin on my face. and also some form of camouflage gear so that there's no way he saw me. Because I'd love to watch him dressing people down, but yeah. And don't want to be in his presence when he's angry, and that anger's directed at me. But his temper was, in most cases, a fairly good thing for the US Navy, just not necessarily a very good thing for certain members of the US Navy, if they happen to get on his bad side. And finally for today, Bell Ineraura asks, how did the design for the first pre-dreadnoughts come about, and how revolutionary was it compared to Warrior or Dreadnought? Well, most people consider the Majestic class to be the sort of prototypical first pre-dreadnoughts, and for that you can thank Admiral Jackie Fisher, no less, who issued the specification. And in large part they were derived from the Royal Sovereign class, which is why sometimes the argument is made that maybe the Royal Sovereigns reflect the first pre-dreadnoughts, although I tend to fall slightly more in the argument of the Majestics. Now, when it comes to revolutionary, they're not as revolutionary as Warrior or Dreadnought. They're very successful, and they kind of standardise most of the features of the pre-dreadnought that you would later associate. So, steel face-hardened armour, 4 guns in a pair of twin turrets, 1 fore, 1 aft, secondary, tertiary batteries, etc., etc. All the kind of standard pre-dreadnought traits, high freeboard as well. But whereas Warrior represented the pulling together of a number of different technologies that had been under development and experimentation at that point, and did them all very well in general, and there was nothing really like her before that could come anything close to her capabilities. Even Gloire, the thing that prompted the building of Warrior, was significantly inferior to it. And whereas Dreadnought was, well, hardly needs saying to a bunch of people who are interested in naval history who are listening, but obviously it was very revolutionary because of all of its features. The Majestics, they kind of brought together a lot of different features, but they were features that were already in existence, whereas with Dreadnought, there was no all-big gun ship. There was no turbine-driven battleship, etc. Whereas for the Majestics, high freeboard, the Royal Sovereigns did that. Quite a lot of different nations' ships were doing that already. 2 guns fore, 2 guns aft in a twin layout. Well, the Royal Sovereigns did that. And again, a number of other warships had already done that. In fact, all the way back to HMS Devastation, that concept had kind of been floating around here and there. Then you look at some other stuff. So the fully armoured barbette, what was now called a turret. Again, not on Royal Sovereign, present on Majestic, but actually already pulled off on a couple of other Royal Navy designs for smaller ships, and also in practice on a number of other ships in foreign navies at the time. Same with Harvey armour. Again, it had been used in earlier ships, just not on Royal Navy battleships. Even the Majestic's guns, which were 12 inch as opposed to the 13.5 inch on the Royal Sovereigns, they were longer guns. They started the trend towards what we would now recognise as the breech-loading naval rifle with a new cordite propellant, as opposed to the shorter, much stubbier and more built-up guns that the Royal Navy had been using up till that point. But again, breech-loading naval rifles using more advanced propellant and therefore having a longer barrel were also not new. They had been used in a number of other warships, again, both in the Royal Navy and overseas. The key thing was that no one had put all of those things together on a relatively large battleship, a first-rate battleship, and done so quite so successfully at that point. So, whereas Warrior, as I say, took lots of concepts that hadn't really been executed well, if at all, and did them well, Dreadnought, again, took a bunch of concepts which hadn't been executed at all at that point, and put them together and did it fairly well. The Majestics put together a lot of concepts very, very well, but they were things that quite a lot of navies had experimented with or actually done fairly well in individual cases, or maybe had one or two of those innovations on a ship, but not the rest. And that was kind of, this is the sea change, if you like, of where the Majestic showed the way forward for everybody. And you can kind of see how widespread a lot of the things that it pulled together were, because you have the Majestics being built, and very quickly a lot of the other navies that are competing for sort of top spot, well, not top spot with the Royal Navy, but they're competing to be in that top layer, very, very quickly start their own battleship designs which are similar, because everyone understands what the Majestics have done. Whereas if you look at Warrior or you look at Dreadnought, especially with Warrior and to a lesser extent with Dreadnought, everyone is kind of left flat-footed by what they've done, and it takes them a considerably longer period of time to catch up and start building their own equivalents. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock, and indeed it brings to an end the Drydock for this year. For those of you wondering where the Patreon Drydock is at this point, well, that'll be next week, released on Sunday the 3rd of January, or the 2nd if you are on Patreon. And the reason for it being that side of the month rather than this week is simply because I generally try and judge the end of the month, quote unquote, i.e. the end of the week at which I put the Patreon Drydock up, as the end of the last week which has a substantial amount of that month in it. So the forthcoming week, 4 out of the 7 days are in December, so that's where the Patreon Drydock is going to be, on the 3rd of January. And for those of you wondering what was going on with that battleship set that were charging around, shooting at each other and sinking in spectacular manner during the question on scale models, that was footage kindly provided to me by the Australian Battle Group. I promised to give them a shout out. They are a 1:144 scale model warship combat club based in Sydney, Australia. So if you happen to be based in the area and you happen to rather like the idea of charging around a small lake, shooting at each other's battleships with 1/4-inch steel ball bearings, then they're the place for you. Obviously respecting any current restrictions that might be in place, but definitely give them a check out if you're in the area and you think that looks like a good idea. It certainly does look like a lot of fun, and if I ever do find myself in Australia, I shall probably try and look them up. Other than that, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope to see you again soon in the last video for the year on Wednesday. See you then.